Well, good morning, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, depending very much of where you're joining from. And from what I can see here in the chat, you're joining from absolutely everywhere. There are people from Chile, from the US, everywhere in Latin America, Colombia, I've seen names of course, Ethiopia. You know, there are people from India, there are people from very many different parts of Africa. I'd like to welcome you all. Today, we're here to start this year, these webinars this year. Happy New Year to you all. This is our first webinar for 2020, and we're starting with a bang. And the reason why we're starting with a bang is because Ethiopia is right now one of the most interesting markets, at least in the region. And we are actually looking at technology that can change and revolutionize the way that we understand energy generation, energy consumption, particularly in Africa, but not only in Africa. So today we're looking at developing mini-grid projects in Ethiopia, and we have two people that are experts in this topic with us, and I'd like to ask them to introduce themselves. So first, I'd like to ask John, if you can please introduce yourself and your experience with this topic.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jan Axel. I work as a senior energy specialist at the World Bank in Washington, D.C., where I'm heading the global facility on mini-grids. And I'm also providing what we call cross-support to our operational colleagues in Nigeria and Ethiopia, where we're providing financing for investments in mini-grids.
Excellent. And Inka, please, I would ask you the same. Could you please introduce yourself and the work you've done and your experience for this topic? Thank you.
Great, perfect, thank you. Greetings from Addis. It's actually holidays here today, so Malcolm Gena to everyone. I am the Gender and Energy Lead for the World Bank. I'm based in ESMAP, and I also provide cross-support to the Africa program, where I lead all gender-related work linked to operations and have been working on the Ethiopia portfolio for the last 4 years.
Thank you very much, John, Inka. Okay, so without further ado, this is the way that it's going to work. First, John is going to give a presentation, then Inka, and then we have some time for answers. So please send your questions using the Q&A box at the bottom. But please bear in mind, we're going to do as many questions as we can. We'll have about 15 minutes or so, but it depends, you know, first come, first serve, essentially. So John, if you please can share the screen with us so that we can get ready. And if you guys have any questions, remember to use the Q&A box, okay? And we'll read them once both presentations have gone through. And just a reminder for everyone, you know, just to make sure, I know that many of you have already been in many webinars before, but we do record this session, and you will have access to the recordings, and you will also get access to the presentations that you're seeing online now. So don't worry, because you will get access to those. John, go ahead.
Great, thank you. Thank you
all. You can see your presentation perfectly and you're ready to go.
Great, thanks. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Great, so thanks everybody for joining. This is, and thanks for Bilan and colleagues to organize this. For us, this is a unique opportunity to seek feedback and to share some of the initial ideas that we're having around the Ethiopia program, in particular on mini-grids. So we're very excited to be here, and everything that we're sharing today is really at a very early stage. So it's very much the way, certainly I look at it, is that it's very much a brainstorm session rather than a report out of what we know and what we want to do. Also, just to step back, that the World Bank, we always work with governments. So the World Bank Group also consists of our colleagues at IFC who work directly with the private sector. But in our case, from the World Bank, we always go and work directly with governments and have to go through governments. So also some of the ideas that we're sharing today, that's in part our ideas, in part it's built on the dialogue that we're having with the governments, but at the end of the day, it's the governments that will make the decision, including in this case the government of Ethiopia. So I also would like all the attendants to keep that in the back of your minds as we move through the discussions. Just to put this program in Ethiopia in a broader context, is what we're seeing from a global perspective is good news. We see momentum in the energy access space, and momentum towards universal access by 2030. If we're gonna get there, it's up to all of us. But there's good hope that we can get there, especially involving all the different solutions of grid extension, mini-grid, and off-grid. So today, if you compare to 2011, we had globally about 82% of access to electricity. Today, we're well above 87%. In addition, we also have seen now Africa stepping up, and for the first time in history, is the electrification ratio outpacing the population growth. So also now in absolute figures, we're starting to see reductions in people without access in Africa. So that's good news. When we look at the countries that are leading the charge, what we're seeing is that these countries come in with a comprehensive approach. So they look at the policies that the country has, they look at government leadership, they come into the sector with strategies, geospatial plans, and with that then investment programs. They focus on grid extension, mini-grid, as well as off-grid. And then there's also a clear emphasis on the sustainability of the whole sector, making as good as the country can, introducing cost-reflective tariffs and or providing concessional financing or subsidies to create a sustainable financial situation. The bank is supporting this effort, and we really have stepped up from an investment perspective over the period of 2014 to 2017. We had about $3.6 billion going to energy access, with a significant portion of that going to mini-grids and off-grid. And in fact, the mini-grid and off-grids are the largest and the fastest growing investment areas in our portfolio. So for us, just to make sure that we're all on the same page, a mini-grid for us is basically anything that is not the main grid. And even mini-grids that are connected to the main grid but have an independent legal entity or are a legal entity, we also consider it as a mini-grid or microgrid, as it is called in other places. So we have a very broad definition, and we did that based on the latest developments in the market, where we now see that mini-grids really can produce high quality service 24/7 and 97% uptime throughout the years. Basically bringing mini-grids in a position that it can provide a well-run utility quality electricity services. So why the bank is getting more and more into mini-grids, it's not because we like mini-grids, even though we do, but there's a lot of economic reasons behind it. Looking at the component cost, these have come down dramatically over the last years, in particular the solar PV systems, the batteries, but also the smart meters, as well as the further introduction of the energy efficient appliances for the solar mini-grids itself. But then also in the ecosystem, where at times a decade ago, mini-grids had to be designed by multidisciplinary teams going into the villages, costing about $40,000 per village. Today, with the geospatial tools, that can be reduced to about $3,000 to $4,000 per site. So this is a magnitude shift, making the whole equation of mini-grids much closer to affordability in our client countries. We also see a lot of movement with larger corporations like the ones here mentioned on the screen, as well as utility, to come in with mini-grids on a portfolio basis. So clearly moving away from 1 or 2 pilots at a time to now looking at portfolios of dozens, if not hundreds of mini-grids to roll out. So the overall picture is, for us, mini-grids are becoming more and more competitive from a costing perspective, having a significant increase in quality of service delivery, and we also now see the rollout pace being much faster than it used to be. We just came back from the commission of the first project in Nigeria, where the project itself was from groundbreaking to commissioning only took 62 days. So about 2 months to get it up and going. So from that perspective, the bank is looking into mini-grids and how to support the industry from an economic perspective, but also from a solution perspective that can contribute to accelerating the pace towards universal access by 2030. So in Ethiopia and other countries, we basically see 2 ecosystems, 2 industries that are entering into the mini-grid space. One is the utilities, and in Ethiopia, EU is really taking the lead there. They have started with their initial pilots. They had support from the Korean government with a mini-grid just outside the capital. They're now implementing 12 mini-grids on their World Bank funded program. And with the African Development Bank, there's an additional 37 projects that they're now preparing. Of this proposed program, ADELE, of the $400 million with World Bank support, there's about $100 to $150 million that is earmarked for the mini-grid sector. And that could translate to somewhere between a few hundred to maybe up to 1,000 mini-grids that can be supported under the program. So in part, that is with the national utility. In part, that will be with the private sector, or a combination of the 2 of them. So I think this is in this slide, you see the different ecosystems, the different stakeholders, and the different institutional setups and regulations that will come into play. And this is very much an ongoing dialogue in Ethiopia on how to design a program properly. And maybe in the early stages, we'll have 2 or 3 approaches in parallel to get the industry going. One with the utility, another with the private sector or cooperatives to get the systems off the ground. So for us, we really appreciate that every country is different, and every country comes in with its own environment and its own priorities and decision-making process. What we do know is that about 8 to 10 issues or core questions need to be answered one way or the other. So a good example is always the setting of retail tariffs. In some countries, the answer to that is we're happy to have cost-reflective tariff. In other countries, it's we want to go with a universal tariff. In both cases, designs of mini-grid programs are possible. It's just that they need to be tweaked for these particular circumstances. So from a World Bank perspective, we're quite active, as mentioned before. We have now about 34 operations with a Minigrid component, of which about $700 million is coming from IDA and SREP and other World Bank managed funds, leveraging about $1 billion from the private sector, government and development partners. We have another 14 operations in preparation, under preparation, including the one that we're discussing today in Ethiopia. So just to indicate here that this is not the first program, but that it's and in that sense that we're not alone in this endeavor, but that we can really build on a lot of experiences that are happening in the world at the same time. Yes. So as briefly mentioned, of these 8 to 10 issues, let me just highlight maybe 4 or 5 of them at this stage. One aspect that we're looking at is the business models, and I also briefly touched upon that. In Ethiopia, we do have an environment where we're basically dealing with a closed economy that is starting to open up, and where the utility has played the key role of service in electricity service delivery in the country. We have to work with the utility in order to get things going at an early stage. At the same time, the utility, as well as the government, as well as private sector and development partners, all are saying the same thing, that we need to move beyond that. So either in a public-private partnership with the utility, or piloting some purely private sector-led initiatives, or having a combination of these 3 business models in an early stage of the program. So we're talking that through, and we really would love to have your feedback on that as well. If there are creative ideas out there, this is a time to bring it forward, so that we can make it part of our preparation process, but also make it part of the investment program, if that seems to be the way to go. The different models that we have, that we're learning from in different countries, I will not go through it in great detail. The slides will be available after the webinar, but just to indicate that there's quite some experience out there that we can build on for the Ethiopia design. So the second key point that we want to raise is that a mini-grid program without productive uses is basically a non-existing program. We're very outspoken about that, based on extensive work that we have done over the last years, that a mini-grid with only household connections, with 1 or 2 or 3 light bulbs with a phone charger, are much better off from an economic financial perspective, having these electricity services delivered with standalone solar systems. A location that is well chosen, that has economic activities, where one have suppressed productive uses in these communities, and based on that, the mini-grid is coming into being, has a much greater chance of overall sustainability in the long run. And this graph just emphasizes this, that if the load factor of a mini-grid is low, the gray area 22%, the LCOE is 55 cents per kilowatt hour. But if the load factor is very high, in the case of 80% with a what we call anchor load, for example, a telecom tower or an irrigation system, then the LCOE reduces dramatically to 35 cents per kilowatt hour. And these are the costs. So this is a system, the LCOEs mentioned here are without concessional financing or without subsidies. So incorporating subsidies will bring the LCOEs, will bring the tariffs to a much more affordable level for the end users. So in Ethiopia, we have started with, we're building on several initiatives where the agriculture is looked at in great detail. There seems to be a lot of momentum around irrigation and the potential for introducing better irrigation systems, and with that moving away from one harvest per season economy to maybe 2 or 3 times, leading to rural economic development. So the way we're coming in at this is from an appliance perspective, and here you see this the 6 sectors that together with ATA, the Ministry of Agriculture, RMI, and other organizations, we're trying to bring these sectors now together and have a subset of appliances for each of these sectors being focused on to help create these economic development and productive uses, and with that the sustainability of the mini grids. Appliances, even after the communities are sold on that these appliances need to come in many cases are too expensive, have a too high upfront cost for the end users. So the introduction of end user financing, either through the mini grid operator or microfinance institutions or otherwise, is certainly also a major priority for the program that we're working on. So the third element for us is that we're having the discussion with the government is on the regulations, and there's a lot of momentum. And this is just to indicate again that it's much more a decision tree than coming in with a preset notion. The overall consensus there again is that there need to be a solution to the retail tariff, that the universal tariff that is currently in place is very low, and that means that for an access program with mini grids, that you would then need a significant amount of subsidies, or that the retail tariffs associated with the productive users or with mini grids can be different from the universal tariff, allowing for lower involvement of public funding. So these discussions are ongoing, and some of the draft regulations around mini grids are available with the regulator on their web pages, and we're now reviewing that. But we also would love the participants, if they're interested in the Ethiopian market, to please also have a look at that and share their views on where this should go. This is just to indicate that regulations should not be stagnant regulations, but that they really should grow over time with the growth of the mini grid sector. In the initial phase, maybe a little bit more open to allow parties to come in over time with the number of people being served, and more monopolistic behavior coming into the picture, being a bit more detailed oriented and rigorous. So this slide just on the access to finance, just to indicate what I just said before, that with a relatively high load factor, the cost will come down, but then also if, for example, with a private sector-led component and a performance-based grant introduced, then you can see tariffs coming down into the teens per kilowatt hour, making it affordable to a very large part of the population in Ethiopia. The focus of the program for now is proposed to be on solar hybrid mini-grids, not to exclude other renewable energy mini-grids, but with the scaling that is happening now around solar mini-grids and the potential for cost reduction and for the rollout of portfolios instead of individual projects, we really think that this is where also the emphasis will come under the Ethiopia program. Two more. The geospatial portfolio planning that I already mentioned is very much an ongoing process for Ethiopia. And here is an example of Nigeria, where the government went through a similar program, a process identifying on a national level where it makes sense to have mini-grids. In that case, it was tens of thousands of mini-grids, and on economic parameters, bringing a portfolio down to resulting in what is the portfolio with the best bang of the public buck in the country. And then uploading this information on a platform that then can be used for either bidding out under an EPC and O&M contract approach, or providing it as market intelligence to the private sector, who can then choose the sites that they want to develop. The last slide is on the international and local industry. That, as mentioned, there's a big ask in the country to have partnerships, and we have also seen this in other places, that with an increased emphasis of the private sector and utilities, international utilities into the sector, there is almost a natural match between these parties who have a great understanding of the technology, have access to semi-commercial and commercial financing, but they have and lack the on-the-ground experience in the client countries. And in Ethiopia, that's no different. So we see a great opportunity for partnership between the international local industry to help get the mini-grid program off the ground. Just to indicate that a lot of these more generic lessons, we have recently documented this in our latest report on mini-grids for 500 million people. So it's available on our webpage, and we go into a bit more of the detail around some of these issues that I just highlighted. And it also will help to inform the dialogue in Ethiopia about the experiences in other countries. So maybe just to close off, that we're in dialogue also with the government about having a national event around mini-grids in February 13, and maybe 2 days, February 13, 14, or February 12 and 13. But this is just to bring this to your attention, that as mentioned, this is an ongoing dialogue, and we very much would like to have you there as well. The invitations will go out shortly, and we'll make sure that if you show interest through the chat, and that we'll also share the invitation with you. So with that, Bilan, I've lost track of time. I hope I'm still okay. But with that, let me hand it back to you.
Thank you very much, John. If I can just ask you to stop sharing your screen, and I would also request, if you have the link to the mini-grids for 500 million people, you can maybe put it in the chat so that people can, just download it directly, because I mean, it's a large document, but it has a lot of detail. If you need anything further, it's definitely there. So thank you very much, John. Inka, I'm going to now ask you please to share your screen. As I predicted, because I knew this, John was going to go over time, but you still have your 15 minutes, so don't worry. We'll still have 10 minutes or so for questions, questions thereafter, to answer questions. So go ahead, Inka. We
Great.
can hear you, and we can see your presentation perfectly.
Fantastic. So I'm going to complement what John has spoken about and come in with the gender lens, because I think we've really started to realize that we're making big investments in sectors, we're building human capital, and we know that there are poverty reduction elements to this work, but unless specifically looked at, we don't often reap those benefits. And just like Jan said, we in no way are saying these are all the models. We really, really would like to leverage all the expertise in the room and yeah, hear from you in terms of what you think works, what's practical, because we also know that many grid developers, utilities and other stakeholders are under extreme, they sometimes in challenging situations. So we hear that as well. So I'm going to be focusing on closing gender gaps in Minigrid sector with the focus on what we've done in Ethiopia and other countries as well. And we basically, if we don't do anything around this issue, we're going to wait another 217 years, and that doesn't seem too fun. The World Bank focuses on these issues for 3 reasons. We believe it enhances development outcomes. So if we're talking about a mini-grid, for example, we want to have our users be as productive as possible. So they're actual, you know, they're bringing goods to market, they're transforming their lives. And then we also think there's a moral imperative to this work. Sometimes we don't have the business case, for instance, on working on women's employment and talent management issues when you don't have positive balance sheets at a utility level. And then in terms of risk management, and this is particularly important for mini grids depending on the size, is that you often bring in external labor. We've had a lot of reflection at the World Bank in terms of gender-based violence and the power dynamics between laborers that might not be from that community or people from the community who will now be earning cash income. There are issues around prostitution, there are issues around pregnancy, and there are issues around sexual harassment. So these are issues that we're actually going to have already started working on in terms of the mini-grid work in Ethiopia that's coming down the pipeline or being developed right now. So we have a lot of countries in the world. There's not one that's gender equal yet. Even Iceland and Norway are struggling to, for instance, reduce pay gaps for equal work. And we know that there are really big investments in the energy sector happening every year, in the trillions, for example, in 2018. And the argument we put forward is that when there's money and people involved, there's always opportunities to address these issues. We also know that there's a real business case to looking at these issues in terms of GDP growth. And we also know that there are you know, you're not harnessing your full talent in terms of when you make investments in female engineers and then they graduate and then they go to institutions and businesses that don't take them seriously, don't think they're a valuable asset, etc., and don't retain them, and then they go to health and education. So we think this is important to look at. In terms of what mini-grids has to do with gender equality, this is often spoken about, but we know that there are time and drudgery elements to energy services, and those fall on women. So if you're talking about mills and blenders and refrigerators and also complementary technologies around electric stoves, etc., you can see 2 to 3 hours of time saving, and then the non-tangibles are really drudgery, which is basically your life is tough and you're using technologies that have been around forever. We also know from studies in South Africa, Nicaragua, and Guatemala that we have women entering the labor force at higher rates due to electrification. So of course this links to the time and drudgery discussion. Around agency and voice, you have a lot of opportunity in electrification committees to make sure that women are represented. And we've found endlessly that if we don't kind of nudge for this participation, we see men setting priorities around planning, who should be electrified, what services matter. So you might be missing out on a women's group that is producing soap, or clinics that might be off the beaten track and are not being prioritized, or water pumping, etc. And then around safety. So women have different safety needs to men and might think that public lighting in markets or certain streets is more important. And therefore it's important for mini grid developers to really have that conversation. Just a quick summary of what we do. We work on addressing data gaps, and I'll speak to some of those and how they relate to the mini-grid sector. We try to push new research forward. So work we do on geothermal and various other issues, and Jon and I also work together on the mini-grid handbook. Then our main focus is actually sitting with teams and clients and working on the operations. Over $4 billion of investment went to board or were approved last year, and in 55, actually 61% of those projects, we worked with clients on addressing gender gaps, and that's exciting shift for us. And we no longer really talk about mainstreaming. We really try to talk about jobs, entrepreneurship, skills development, and assets. And then we also try to build partnerships. So our main clients, as Jon already pointed out, are utilities and ministries and development banks. But we also like to partner with CSOs and various partners on the ground. Over the last few years, we've worked in about 94 countries. The work is focused on various issues depending on the need of those client countries. So in Africa, of course, that's very focused on the access agenda. In Latin America, we're looking at the sticky gaps in labor force participation and fostering talent. In the SIDS countries around geothermal, you'll often need 2 to 3 people managing a geothermal plant, and then you can put investments in to really bring women into the sector and make sure that they have the skills and feel welcome in that space. And these are some of the areas we work on. So we work on off-grid, clean cooking, women in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and we do a lot of work on data because we have a lot of fun with that. So coming to Ethiopia, we've been working here for the last 3.5 years. We basically came in and spent a year mapping all the gender gaps that could relate to the energy sector. We, for instance, found that there were only 10% academics, female academics in the sector. So we know that role modeling has a huge influence on where you see yourself in your life. If you can't see it, you can't be it. We also saw that there were a lack of childcare provisions in the energy sector. We knew that there were no sexual harassment policies in place at the utility level and safe transport and toilets and facilities. So what we decided to do under a $2 billion portfolio is to really engage stakeholders and put in place tangible actions under a $375 million electrification program. And as Jon mentioned, there are some mini grids under that. And all of that was bundled up with technical support also to the National Electrification Program, which there are 2 parts of. One was on-grid and one was off-grid. So on the on-grid side, commitments were made in terms of getting from a baseline of 20% female employment to 30%. That was a national target set. So we came in with financing and technical assistance to make that happen. Some of the work we, for instance, have done is to ensure that there's scholarship program available for about 44 female employees of the utility that has 22,000 employees. So it's across 11 regions. It's really extensive, that they can get master's degrees because we can see that women have lower educational attainments and therefore they cannot progress in their careers. We also put in place support in terms of financing for short upskilling programs and internship programs between universities and the utility. We see that there's really that lack of the exchange on what are the sector developments, what are the potential areas of opportunities in terms of career journey. We're financing childcare provision in all 11 regions, so lactation rooms, nurses, etc. for children, and this of course has benefits for both male and female employees. We're also working on sexual harassment, so there are policies in place, there are repercussions if codes of conduct are broken, and this is really important to retain talent. We're also working on female entrepreneurship in the off-grid sector, but there's also a story link below, and you can have a look, and I'll try weave it into the further points that I raise. So looking at the mini-grid sector, we've kind of mapped areas where there are entry points. So you can think about the owners of a company, you can think of the employees, you can think about the managers, you can think about the customers, you can think about the government, you can think about the value chains and the suppliers, you can think about access to finance, and all of these have gender dimensions. So I'll briefly be running through some of these areas, starting with policy and procurement, moving on to what's possible under business models, looking at institutional footprints, customer engagement, and the consumer finance models, and then productive uses of energy and monitoring and evaluation. And again, this is not an exhaustive list. In many ways, it's been kind of hard for us to document best practices in the mini-grid sector, so we welcome opportunities and you sharing some of that, because often it sits with people and it's not published. So policy and procurement. I've mentioned that we put in place really tangible language in the National Electrification Program with the government on the on-grid and off-grid sector. And that was commitments on employment, addressing issues around affordability and access to finance, investing in skills development. You know, we're going to be building mini-grids, so how are we going to make sure that all that cash income is not going to just land in the hands of men, especially when you're in rural contexts where you're starting with a low skill set in any case. So we in the RISE report, which is our regulatory indicators for sustainable energy report, we've been mapping what governments have actually been doing in terms of looking at gender-specific regulations and electrification planning. And unfortunately, there aren't many best practices. So we have some work in Laos where female-headed households were lagging behind in connection, and they were targeted with the provision of being able to pay off that connection fee over time. We've got some work in Tanzania, and then Ethiopia I've managed. So the recommendation here is really try and involve diverse groups in terms of female business association, agricultural cooperatives in your policy formulation. They might have very different visions and ideas on what matters. Then in terms of procurement, we've got the example from South Africa, which of course can be debated a lot in terms of what the unions think, what the private sector thinks, etc. But non-price factors were embedded in the independent power procurement process in terms of female-owned companies, and then also in terms of the social benefits that should be reaped from the work. Then in terms of your mini-grid business model, we don't know which direction we're going to go in Ethiopia, but we're already working on making sure that, you know, when we're doing our market analysis and we're doing our studies around productive uses of energy, that we at minimum collect sex disaggregated information, that we make sure that our marketing and our outreach activities really ensure that they reach both women and men. We know that people have different aspirations and we need to market for that. And then of course, many grid developers have an incentive to enhance women's participation given their role as energy managers at the household level. Then in terms of also employment, we know that many grid companies have a footprint of employees. So we've been doing a lot of data collection, and you can see this is not related only to the mini-grid sector, but we've been trying to work with companies around the world to look at the technical staff, the non-technical staff, and where they'd like to go in terms of the percentages, in terms of participation, etc. Recommendations on this, and this is really what we've been doing a deep dive on in Ethiopia, is look at the education sector, work on the school to work transition. So, you know, we're about to launch a video on Ethiopia where we look at role modeling, you know, what the issues are in the sector, and then issues around paid family leave, mentorship, etc. So really, how is your company messaging in terms of what the values are and the policies on diversity? This is an example from the Solomon Islands on women's employment, where there are mini grids. This is almost a rural, you're working on low skill jobs to large extent, but there's still economic opportunities in terms of cleaning large solar panels. And the ideas came from the transport sector, which often does very large public works programs. So this has been fantastic work to see go forward, and it builds on the partnership with the Pacific Power Association. So in the previous slide, I mentioned the data on that has been collected by our team. Customer engagement and consumer finance models. It's important to know what the affordability constraints are and who's connected and who's not at this point. So we're lucky to have the multi-tier framework. And for instance, in Rwanda, we see that female-headed households lag both on grid access and off-grid access. Drivers of that are often affordability constraints, lack of awareness about the connection process, not enough education around the benefits of access. So mini-grid developers should draw on this kind of data and look at both, the willingness to pay and then the affordability constraints. There are also different options in terms of structuring the consumer finance models. John mentioned some of these already: subsidies, credit schemes, ready boards, smart end-to-end operations. So all of these really need to consider that women have less access to finance, they borrow less formally, and they face various constraints. So taking the credit line in Ethiopia, we found that this is for the off-grid sector, that men were borrowing at higher rates overall, so at about 72%, and women at about 28% of that access to finance, and they were borrowing for bigger systems, so solar home systems. But then we saw the gap close for lanterns. And again, this brings in the question of, once you go into a community, have these issues in mind and try work with microfinance institutions or development banks to really look at those end user needs. On productive uses of energy, we know that women tend to be less productive if they are farmers. There are various drivers on that in terms of smaller plot sizes, crop choices, mobility constraints, and then norms around the sectors that they find themselves in. So as a mini-grid developer, of course, this is not all your responsibility, but as a utility, and if you want to enhance development outcomes, you should be aware that you might see those differentials, and you're going to have them even more exaggerated if women can't connect upfront to the mini-grid. We have work here in Nigeria. We've made a commitment to enhance productive uses of energy for female-headed businesses and female farmers by 5%. We set this target based on the fact that we knew that the productivity gap was 18.6%, and we've put in place technical assistance of 400,000 to really look at these agro-processing dynamics. Moving to monitoring and evaluation, important really for us in our projects is to set targets, because what isn't measured can't get done. So these are just some examples. You could look at the productivity gaps, or you could look at issues around training opportunities, gaps in women's employment. You could start publishing data on this and setting targets. So these are just some suggestions, and I will stop there just to say that there is a team behind this, and we look forward to really under Adele shaping this agenda and taking it forward from on-grid to off-grid.
Thank you very much, Inka. Thank you very much. I'm just going to ask you to stop sharing your screen so that we can now see you both. And we don't have a lot of time. I think the good thing is that we got a lot more detail, perhaps, that we were planning to originally, with shorter presentations, but this is really interesting. There's been a lot of questions. There's so many of them that I have kind of picked a few of the topics that repeat themselves. And I'd like to ask you, we only have about 5-6 minutes really, and then we should, stop for today. So, if you want to answer, you take your turns, each of the questions, and we'll see how far we can get. So one of the questions that was coming again and again is, what is the minimum viable capacity or total that mini-grid is usually, whether, what is considered a microgrid and what is considered a mini-grid, what are the ranges? So can we clarify that so that people understand, you know? John, do you want to take the question?
Sure. So I think on the terminology microgrid or mini-grid, for us, we use them both. What we see is microgrids is typically used in OECD countries, mini-grids is used in our client countries. But it's not defined by from an engineering perspective. So it's not like a 5 kilowatt system as smaller as a microgrid, 5 kilowatt and larger is a mini-grid. So we use them both. And then on the viability, I think today what it really comes down to is that it's not a size matter for the mini-grids. You can have ones that are as small as just providing electricity to maybe 50 or 100 clients, up to hundreds of thousands of clients, for example, we're seeing now in DRC. But it's very much the focus is on that the right locations are selected, and that with that also the productive uses is promoted, and based on that, the viability of the individual projects as well as the portfolio then comes into being.
One of the questions, well, let me ask first a technical thing. Someone was asking, you know, you actually don't mention storage in the little drawing that you had. Is storage considered in these mini grids or not? And are they renewable by and large? Just so that we can also put that.
No, so again, it's driven by the economics. So mini grids in the past used to be diesel based, and in some countries run-of-river hydro based in Nepal and other places. But today, with the cost coming down on the solar side, it pushes out the diesel fuel cost. It's cheaper to invest in a solar panel than to buy your diesel fuel, for example. And then now with the batteries cost coming down, it becomes a hybrid system where the solar electricity is produced during the day, stored in the batteries, and then for the peaks around 6 or 7 o'clock at night, you then have a bit of diesel backup system. So it's very much a solar battery system with some level of diesel technology.
Of diesel backup, okay. Just one more along the lines of the technical side. Why pick mini grids and not home kits? Like, what is the reasoning behind going down this line rather than the other?
It's consumption. So if a home or an end user is just using or has a need, an electricity demand for that are small, so for lighting, for charging, maybe for a radio, then typically a solar home system is the better solution from a financial and economic perspective. However, when you start to introduce larger loads, like power tools, welding machines, refrigerating, large-scale ventilation for storage, then it makes much more sense to go with a mini-grid in comparison to a standalone system. But these two areas have some overlap, but that's the rough division.
So there were a bunch of questions about LCOE and how this is going to come down, and you had an assumed decrease in LCOE that was significant from 2018 to 2013. The question is really, what is driving that drop in LCOE?
Yeah, so it's a combination of all these factors. So one is that with the introduction of these solar hybrid mini grids, now you have a unique opportunity to also introduce your electric appliances. So if that is done as part of a national program, if that is done with a focus on energy efficient appliances, then you already save on the investment upfront. So for example, a lot of the appliances today have 50 to 60% less energy consumption than they had 5 to 10 years ago. So using those appliances and designing your mini grid for that now reduces the investment cost for your mini grid by more than 200%. So that's the starting point. And then on top of that, you have the reduction in the components, the solar PV systems, as mentioned, the battery cost, the energy management systems, which includes a controller and the inverter, the smart meters. All of that is dramatically, the costs are dramatically declining, not necessarily by the success of the mini-grid sector, but by the success elsewhere. Solar PV utility scale is driving the cost down for PV. Batteries are driven down by the automotive industry. And the energy management systems, for example, are very much a spin-off of what was used with the variable renewable energy like wind for large projects. So that's what is driving these cost reductions. And then also what I mentioned is the whole portfolio approach, where now the geospatial planning upfront. In the past, significant investments had to go into that, sometimes as high as the cost of the investment themselves. That now also can, for about 90–95%, can be done behind the desk rather than having to go into each village individually. So that's what's driving it.
Hope that also, you know, financing costs will come down over time, perhaps, yeah. You know, with local banks. But I can understand that at least the components in that part is slowly coming down. Yeah. All right. One thing about local skills, a lot of people here are saying, you know, even if someone else comes and builds it, you know, we still need local know-how, upskilling, and, you know, I think Inka was talking more along those lines, you know, with the gender item or like thing included as well. But, you know, it's really, how is it going to, this technology transfer going to happen? You know, how does that happen? So I don't know whether either of you want to talk about this.
No, I think so. Let me kick it off, and then it's exactly also what Inka was saying. There's a very big gender element to that. So one is that because these projects are so community client focused, that if you don't have the proper buy-in of the local communities and the potential customers, lessons have learned time and again that you're just setting yourself up as an investor or as a developer or as a national program for failure. So it's very important early on that this local buy-in is there. And with that, the local industry plays a critical role, simply because in many cases, also in Ethiopia, they have been on the ground for many years. So that's very important. And I think also what we're seeing, and Inka can build on that, or expand it, is that we're seeing that where women are involved, the viability of the project goes up from a financial economic perspective, but also from a sustainability perspective, in relation to productive uses, in relation to handling of financial matters. There's a lot of evidence that making that part of an overall design is essential.
Great. Yeah. So one of the big challenges also for us has been to map both the providers of upskilling, both the university and more the technical training institutes, and then at the same time to build the HR systems in the utility, and to look at the skills in the private sector, both internationally and locally. We like to segment this in terms of really high skilled and then more vocational training. So we are currently in the process of working on that in terms of the mini-grid sector, but we've been doing a lot of that work for the utility itself and the broader energy sector. So really, again, thinking about recruitment, retention, promotion, and making sure that also the sector messages in terms of new developments and market opportunities, and building good HR systems, which are often not digital, etc.
Thank you very much, Jonica. And unfortunately, we're at the end of an hour. We had so many questions. We haven't really been able to get on, with them. But I mean, we knew, time is limited. There has been a lot of interest, as you can see from the chat and from the questions. So the World Bank and SMAP is constantly working in this topic. You have so much intelligence out there. Visit the website by all means, and those people that have signed up also will receive information about the event that we are planning, and that you guys are planning in Addis Ababa. So anything else you guys to add before we say goodbye?
Well, I'm seeing all these comments and questions coming in. We're really going to take them seriously. So I don't know if we can promise that we will answer all of them individually. I'm inclined to say yes, but I think reality after the webinar might be slightly different. But we're definitely going to look at all of them. So thank you so much for gathering those feedbacks.
Thank you very much. And Inka, you have anything to add?
No, we're always available. I'm happy to hear any sort of knowledge and developments on gender and mini-grids, because yeah, that would be fantastic to know more about.
Right, well, thank you very much. We're going to say goodbye for now, and we'll see you hopefully in the next webinar or maybe in the event in Addis Ababa. Thank you very much.